Hi everyone. Well, today's video, today's video is inspired by a biography that I came across while doing research for a client yesterday on Russia, and I came across a biography of Boris Yeltsin written by Leon Aaron. He's a Russia scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and I was reading the epilogue of this. It's a huge, enormous volume, a very detailed look at Boris Yeltsin. But in the epilogue of the book, Leon gets into, well, what is Boris Yeltsin's legacy? How do we think about him as a politician and a leader? How do we ultimately judge him? And I want to get into Boris Yeltsin, but I want to first step back and pose a broader question, which is what came to mind when I was reading this Yeltsin book, which is, how should we judge political leaders? And this is a subject that I've thought about for a long time. I think for some of you who don't know my background, I'll just go over it briefly. One of the decisions that I had made very early on as I decided to go into politics and policy was that I really wanted to get to know the people who are actually shaping, making, doing policy. And so one of the ways that I did that was I always sought out opportunities really to work one-on-one or very closely with powerful people. And I did it both working on their memoirs, where I got to work with them when they were in a more reflective mode. And then also in government, even though I was relatively junior, I was a special assistant to an undersecretary, and so I got to work with him closely. And when you look at most of the work that I did, I mean, basically what I was looking at was basically the intersection of how the conservative movement, the Republican Party, so forth, intersected with major foreign policy decisions. And the reality is that when you look at the period where I've really worked, which is basically, I would say 2004 through the present day, the reality is that broadly, most of the issues that I worked on, most of the people I worked with were part and parcel of very significant policy and political failures. The most obvious evident ones were the overreach of U.S. foreign policy, which occurred in the Iraq War specifically, but also in the War on Terror. And then also this collapse of the conservative movement, going from a tradition that embodied and was fulfilled by the Reagan Revolution, that had a number of wins in the 90s, but then really decayed with the excesses of the George W. Bush administration, and then really culminated with what I consider to be a real low point with the Trump presidency, where we are now. Now, I think when people are sort of taking part and reflecting on a period or an era or a series of decisions that go disastrously, horribly wrong, one temptation or one inclination, especially for people who are intellectual and like to research and dig into rabbit holes, is that they gravitate toward conspiracy theories. But one of the issues was that because I had worked with so many of these people at a high level and in an intimate way, and I got to see their archives, their very raw papers, and I also got to just talk to them one-on-one and dig into a lot of these issues. One of the things I realized was that conspiracy theories do not really account for most of these issues. I mean, they, and I'll get into why, but I was left with this question of, how are people who are obviously, from what I could tell, sincere, well-meaning, intelligent, not like conspiratorial in the way their critics talk about, how did their decisions, how did their actions lead to such horrible consequences? And I basically came to a couple of conclusions. I mean, I think one was that I came to really question both the efficacy and the morality of trying to propose or promote policy outcomes using the force of government. I mean, when you really think about what politics, what government are really about. Although there are many different sources of legitimacy, what makes government the entity that it is that it has a monopoly on violence and force. And I've come to just question whether force and coercion is really a either efficacious or ethical way of getting outcomes. But I was, nevertheless left with this dilemma where I spent a long time, thinking about every time that I sort of looked at these people closely who are making policy, who are influential, I found them wanting in some respect, either in terms of their judgment, their process, their intellect, or something. But eventually I realized that, at some point when I was reaching this conclusion about every single individual, that they had these flaws, I realized that actually it wasn't that these people were necessarily the problem. It was more that my model and my concept and my expectations about what's really possible was itself the problem. Now, so what this ended up leading me toward is, one, as I mentioned, a real skepticism of what government and government power can do. But it also made me reflect, sort of think differently about how do we cast judgment, and what expectations should we have of people who are political leaders. And one of the things I realized was that many of the shortcomings that I observed in powerful people or influential people, part of it was maybe the harsher criticisms were to some degree stemming from immaturity. I think one of the things you just realize as you get older is that people are flawed, they're imperfect, and there are limits on what can be done about that. But the other reality that I observed is that it doesn't really matter what kind of a society you're living in, whether it's a democratic society, authoritarian society, or even really whether we're talking about elected officials or people who are appointed. Anyone who really becomes powerful, who ends up wielding a great deal of influence or clout in society, they get to that point because they arise out of the polity or the country or the entity that they're coming from. And so naturally, they embody many of the virtues of the society they're coming from, but also many of the pitfalls. And the reality is, if someone becomes just too far away from the people they're representing, the people for whom they're wielding power, they don't get to these positions in the first place. And so, if you have an expectation that people are always going to be very, very rational and logical in the way that they approach policy, well, if you're really that logical and rational, you're not going to really make it in a political environment where emotions really matter. Or if you have a very, very principled, moralistic way of viewing the world, and that's how your conduct governs, I mean, maybe you can end up as a political prisoner somewhere, but you're just not going to rise to a certain level of power in a society that doesn't have as rigid of a moral code. And one of the hardest things for me to grasp is that although I've written a great deal about the role of IQ and how IQ is an intelligence is really predictive of people's success, I also came to another conclusion, which is that when the gap between someone's IQ and the general population, when that gap becomes too large, the reality is that high IQ can actually become an obstacle. And so, if you're expecting people in political power to be above a certain level of intelligence, it's not going to happen, because at a certain level of intelligence, you can no longer really relate to ordinary people in a way that is ultimately necessary to wield political power. And so, that's why many of the smartest people in our society, many of the most capable people in our society, we often pose the question, why in a country so talented and so with so many capable people do we end up with these clownish, buffoonish politicians? And the answer is obvious, because you kind of need to be a clown and a buffoon. And if you're too smart and disciplined and whatever, you're probably just going to end up in a more technocratic place in the private sector. So then, as I came to terms with the fact that, one, our institutions and government is just inherently not all that capable of effectuating good outcomes, and that there are limits on the quality and the type of people who can really, in a realistic way, really rise to senior levels of power, paradoxically, I actually began to view the actions and the judgments of political leaders by a different standard. And I came to realize that rather than expecting them to do all kinds of great things for us, that's not a realistic standard, especially when in the process of trying to achieve very ambitious goals, there's usually a blowback or a series of negative externalities that end up being far worse than the problem itself. And so I've come to think that perhaps we should judge political leaders and politicians by a different standard, which is not so much, what did they, what were the shortcomings of what they achieved, but rather when they were in positions of power and they had faced every temptation to make a decision or use their power in a certain way that very likely could have gone in the wrong way. When did they show restraint? When did they hold back? When did they prevent something even worse from happening? And when you view it in this context, you realize that actually many of the criticisms of powerful people, great people, are actually often misguided, because although they point out maybe what could have been better, they fail to account for the fact that politicians and political leaders also often deserve enormous credit for not doing things that other people would have done in that position that could have gone wrong. And so, having this frame of mind, I think, made me really appreciate Leon's epilogue of this biography of Boris Yeltsin. Because I think, especially not having lived through the Cold War and the early parts of the 90s, my impression of Boris Yeltsin was always shaped a little bit more by the tail end of his life and career. And I think we all, to some degree, think of Yeltsin as being this kind of drunkard, this buffoon, this sloppy guy who was, unfailingly corrupt, and one who could never quite bring Russia to a genuine post-war transition to democracy, one who laid the groundwork for a lot of problems for the U.S. But Leon's book, and it's important to note that this book was published in the year 2000, so I suspect that, obviously, with the benefit of 18 further years, Leon, obviously, I imagine, might amend some of his take on Yeltsin. But the point is that this epilogue is it's fair, but I would say also very apologetic, very generous to Boris Yeltsin. And he talks about Yeltsin, and he goes through all his achievements. But one of the big points that Leon makes that really resonated with me, and I think are correct and profound, is that for all of Yeltsin's failings, for all the things all the shortcomings, Yeltsin's legacy, in my view and in Leon's view, will largely be positive, in large part for what he did not do, that made him an aberration, made him unique among Russian leaders. So number one was that Yeltsin resisted the temptation of making nationalism a central organizing principle of national unity and cohesion at a time of dislocation and disarray. So Leon writes that he never resorted to jingoism to palliate the pain of market reform. A Weimar Russia defeated in the Cold War, bereft of empire, fallen from global superpowerdom, and in the throes of a sharp economic decline, did not become a national socialist Russia. So, one of the things that the point Leon's making, and it's a fear that really animated American and Western policymakers for a long time, was that Russia, being this proud empire, now faced with this ignominious defeat and collapse, would they go the way of the Weimar Republic? Would really radical, fanatical ideologies come to the fore? Would a radicalized, hyper-nationalist Russia, no longer even with the pretense of a higher ideology like communism, would it go in that direction? And what Leon argues that Yeltsin had that opportunity. He had that choice. He could have. There was a sizable contingent in Russia that wanted to go in that direction. It was a vision, in fact, that Yeltsin was up against in 1996 when he ran for re-election, but Yeltsin always resisted that, which goes to the second point, that although Russia's democratic consolidation never quite happened, Yeltsin personally always had a certain respect. Maybe it was a grudging respect, but a grudging respect for respect nevertheless for free speech and democratic institutions. And so when you look at virtually every critical juncture that Yeltsin had, where he could have really cracked down on free speech, he could have cracked down on the media, he could have really grossly undermined democratic institutions. He wasn't a perfect Democrat, but he always held back. And so Leon gives a couple examples here. One was that if you remember, Russian history, one of the things that brought Yeltsin to the fore, really in a public way, was that he was, he was a rival to Mikhail Gorbachev, and this was a vexing reality for American policymakers, because we had this partner, relatively benign partner in Gorbachev, but as he was sort of getting older, losing legitimacy, Yeltsin was one of these populist democratic leaders coming to the fore. And there was a big debate, especially in the George H.W. Bush administration, about just how much do we take a gamble on Yeltsin. But what really brought Yeltsin to the fore was when there was a brief coup in Russia by fascists in 91. Yeltsin famously kind of went to Moscow, stood on the tanks, and stood firm for Russian democracy. Now, obviously, the coup did not go anywhere, and Yeltsin ended up taking charge. And one of the points that Leon makes here is that Yeltsin's lenience toward the unrepentant and violent enemies who orchestrated the coup would be remarkable in any revolution, but in the Russian political tradition, it was truly amazing. So in other words, when you really look at that period, virtually any other Russian leader, Leon argues, would have really cracked down on these people, sent them off to the gulag, tortured them, whatever. Yeltsin he went out of his way not to use the prosecutorial powers of the Russian government, of the Russian state, to prosecute these people. And some of them actually ended up even running for office in the new Russia. And Yeltsin showed that being on the wrong side of political power did not have to end in your head getting chopped off or whatever. Another example that Leon gives is the war in Chechnya, and this is a darker period, arguably, of Yeltsin's presidency, where he oversaw just a ruthless, gruesome campaign in Chechnya. But what Yeltsin shows is that even during the worst periods of this Chechnya campaign, one of the things Yeltsin did not do was prevent the Russian TV and the Russian media from covering the war. And so Leon writes, he's now writing about Chechnya. In its explicitness and anti-government animus, and the audacity and gruesomeness of aired images, the coverage of the Chechen war by Russian television, including the state-owned channels, was probably without parallel for any country at war, save perhaps that of the United States and Vietnam. Yet no matter how much some members of the government would have liked to wring the necks of newspapers and networks, the Rubicon was never crossed. Not a single newspaper or television channel was censored, much less closed down, and not a single public opponent of the war was harassed, much less arrested or harmed. Never before in Russian history had nonviolent political competition and free electoral choice borne so directly and effectively on the Kremlin's major national security policy. So basically, here Leon's alluding to the fact that although Yeltsin did oversee the savage bombing campaign of Chechnya, in his later years, as part of his re-election and so forth, he ended up making common cause with the critics of this campaign in Chechnya, and he wound down the war, in large part due to political pressure. And then finally, a big example that Leon provides is how Yeltsin handled what he calls the Jewish question. And if you look in the Soviet Union, anti-Semitism was rife in the Soviet Union. It was a matter of state policy. And just as an example here, which I actually did not know, that so in the Soviet Union of the 1970s, even those who were half Jewish, who by whatever metric had half Jewish blood, could not be admitted to Moscow University. And one of the things Yeltsin did was he he first of all sent a signal by including a very in a very conspicuous, prominent way Jews in the top echelon of the government. And not only did he do that, but he also reissued new Russian passports, and he intentionally removed on the Russian passport the line for nationality. This was a great hindrance for Jews historically in Russian society, because this is where they would have to note their Jewish identity, which naturally in a anti-Semitic society like the Soviet Union and then Russia, prevented Jews from seeking any number of educational and employment opportunities. And Yeltsin's, for the most part, noble handling of this Jewish question, which I think historically has been a test of how committed a government generally is to democratic norms and so forth. One, it led to a exodus of Jews from Russia, which was obviously an enormous drain of human capital. And Yeltsin allowed this to happen. But the other thing that happened is that you begin to see in Russia Jewish civil society emerging in a way that it never really had before. So Yeltsin, Leon Aaron concludes his study of Boris Yeltsin, where he writes, when much of the story told in these pages fades and notoriously parsimonious history reduces Yeltsin's life's work to one sentence, it is likely to read, and he's quoting now, he made irreversible the collapse of Soviet totalitarian communism, dissolved the Russian Empire, ended state ownership of the economy, and held together and rebuilt his country while it coped with new reality and losses. And so you see here in the Yeltsin case study that a leader, a politician as flawed as Boris Yeltsin, one who's open to any number of criticisms, when you apply a different standard and a mindset, and you judge leaders not only by what they failed to achieve and what their shortcomings were, but also the things where they showed restraint, where they did not take actions that in all likelihood others in their position would have, and that could have led to far worse consequences. That is another side of their legacy that usually ends up casting their legacy in a more positive, or in my view at least, a more reasonable light. There are a couple of questions here that I want to tackle. What section of society benefit from their policies? If you could write here who specifically you're referring to, that would be helpful, and I can answer it. John here is writing, are there politicians you regard as having been too smart to be in power? Well, this is an interesting question for a couple of reasons. I would say that the biggest reason why we don't have intelligent people necessarily in positions of power. But by the way, it's important to make clear here. I mean, when you look at, and there's a scholar by the name of Jonathan Y, who's looked at this issue, where he's tried to gain a rough estimate of the IQ of political leaders. He actually finds that they're well above average. And so even when we like to make fun of politicians or think that they're not all that intelligent, I mean, they actually are, especially at higher and higher levels of government, actually considerably more intelligent than the average American. And if you look at this in a global context, I mean, it's actually in a way a marvel that we even get the quality of leadership that we do. I mean, when you're looking at societies where the average IQ of the population and a population that's empowered by the franchise and so forth, when they have, there are plenty of very powerful, significant regions of the world where you're looking at average IQs between 80, 85 to 100. It's quite an achievement that you can get political leaders with an IQ of 120 plus. But I would also say that when you're looking at the number of political leaders who have 130 plus IQs, and then also have the other attributes of good judgment and conscientiousness and other things that I would include as part of a wise leader, where that's where they're more lacking. Now, I think the question that John's asking here is, why don't we have more politicians at that level? And I would say that there are a couple of things to say here. One is that the biggest reason why we don't have more politicians at that level of intelligence is because they don't run in the first place. And the reason they don't run in the first place is because when you think about all the skills that you have to have, even to be a plausible political candidate, you have to raise money from a lot of people. You have to master different forms of media that have to appeal to the lowest common denominator. You have to move to segments and corridors of the country where that are outside, the corridors that wield power ultimately. And this is not to mention that the emotional toll that is required to be in this realm. So if you're at an IQ of 140, 145, I mean, just like especially if you're more of an introverted person, the idea even of like going and shaking a bunch of hands at a barbecue dinner or something, I mean, it's just such an emotional tax in a way that it isn't for someone maybe one standard deviation below, that you just can't really get there. Now, I mean, to answer the question more directly, are there politicians you regard as having been too smart to be in power? We may actually begin to see this more and more of a test where you have people who are independently wealthy, especially coming from a high finance background or some other form of achievement, where they gain wealth by basically through their cognitive brilliance, like maybe by manipulating markets in a hedge fund or something like that. And then, now more and more, especially with the example of Donald Trump as an outsider, I think we're going to see more and more people like that making a play for political power. But I would say that insofar as you've seen examples of people who are very wealthy, who make their money in the private sector and then try to enter the political fray, the fact that for the most part they've lost out to career politicians or to more conventional politicians, I think is a good example of basically, in a sense, being too intelligent to be in power. One person actually on the horizon here who might be an interesting test case is Michael Bloomberg, who I don't know a whole lot about him, but he appears to be very intelligent, and he had a good run as mayor of New York. But can he, assuming he enters the race, will he be able to navigate a populist political environment, media environment, and ultimately get to the top? I'm skeptical, but I think that he might be a good test case. Okay, hope that helps, and I'll talk to you soon.